really quick sort of thing on sampling, and just like again like common issues with sampling that happens, and just like how to fix them. So let me really quick just set up like an ugly little scene with a sphere. So I'm going to demo this in Arnold, but it's pretty similar for like Redshift and the other. It's pretty similar for Redshift and all of that stuff. What did I just try to map in there? All right. So for the first thing that I usually look for, if you're using any kind of HDR image, they do, I find, tend to be a little bit grainy by default. Please render faster. God, the lag. So you'll notice, like if I scroll in, it's fairly soft lighting, but you can see a little bit of grain in the, like just the colors of kind of everything. So like the highlights, shadows of the ball, like ground plane, and this is all just like generic sort of Lamberts, like it shouldn't really be having that grain on it. So that's a pretty easy fix. Again, anytime I use an HDRI, within the light, like the dome light itself, there's this little box for adjusting the samples. So I usually take that up to something like 3. And hopefully this actually shows up on the projector, but you can see it's made a much smoother render compared to the original like grainy ickiness here. So again, if you're using an HDRI and your whole image is like slightly grainy, you might just need to set the samples in the HDR up individually. Sort of similarly, and this is going to be a little bit more obvious if I throw in an area light, 30. This is like the most aggressively rendered light ever. All right, it's gonna be gorgeous. All right, so if you have like, you know, an area light or like your own manual lights that you've added in here, in this case like this really hideous area light, and you're looking, especially like it'll usually be really, really obvious around the edge of a shadow, especially if it's a soft shadow, where you can see here there's again like a bunch of pretty gross looking grain, and that's something, again, if it's a specific shadow and not just like all of the shadows in the scene, that's something you usually want to adjust in the light itself. So figure out whichever light is causing or like casting that shadow, and then just go in, same thing as the area light, they have their own little sample slider, so I might just try setting that up to 3. And you can see that starts smoothing out that shadow without as much grain as it had before. You might need to set, like, honestly, like depending on how intense your light is, this one's like obnoxiously bright, but I find sometimes the more intense the shadow is, like the brighter the light, you might need to set the samples up a little bit higher to really like crunch down that sampling and make it nicer looking. But yeah, so again, sampling issues in individual shadows, something that you're going to want to look at for in the individual light setting. It is like, honestly, it's really annoying having to go in and like check each light for the sampling, but it does dramatically reduce render time when you can like set dim background lights to sample less. So it's kind of worth the extra annoyance in my opinion. And then the other thing to look out for sampling is, so I mentioned right now just like stuff with the overall lights as a whole. If I'm just gonna set this to be random Arnold material. So if I set this just like Arnold material, I'm gonna turn this like copper. Try copper, see what happens. But you'll notice it might be a little bit hard to see, but if you scroll in and look around the specular highlights, like especially the edges here, there's a little bit of like funkiness happening right in here, where it's just like a little bit grainier. It looks more like a brushed metal, this is very much not supposed to be brushed metal. It's just sort of looking, that's chromy. It's just sort of looking grainy when that was not the intent of the texture. So again, if you ever see issues, a lot of times it'll happen in like metal textures, in the specular highlights if you have a lot of little, divots and stuff catching light. That's actually something that usually affects the whole render and is probably something you're going to need to adjust the settings for globally. So if you go into your render settings and just go to the Arnold renderer, you'll notice all these different tabs here. In this case, I'm going to see what happens if I set the specular to like 5. And again, you can see that that does start to smooth out the sort of weird sampling grainy stuff that was happening. There's still a little bit of it in here, so that might be something. You might just like sort of keep slowly bumping up your renders until it does what you need it to. But usually I have issues. If I have issues in one specular highlight, I'll have issues in other ones. So a lot of times I'll just sort of leave that with a global setting for specular highlights. You'll also see different settings for like, there's other stuff, so diffuse is just for color. Every once in a while I'll try messing with like camera AA and see if that helps. That'll like bump up your render times way faster, but it just sort of like does more samples for the entire render. And you can see maybe a little bit by doing that. It's not totally eliminated like all of the sampling issues, but that did help in conjunction with using this global specular sample slider. And then again, if there's other stuff, like if you're ever working with clear glass and you're like, oh, well, this looks kind of weird inside, it's like maybe kind of grainy, something like that, that's something you'd want to look at the transmission slider for. And then SSS is subsurface scattering. I'm not going to go like hugely into that today, but like if you ever do subsurface scattering, you're probably going to need to like bump that up, because usually by default it looks pretty grainy and awful. But yeah, that's my little spiel on sampling. Does anyone have any questions about that? All right. Cool. If that's the case,